Okay, let's get started. It's the 10th of November, and we're talking this week about food production. We'll be looking at agricultural food production during today's lecture, and then on Thursday, I'll be presenting a longer topic on food from the sea, nutrients from the sea, looking at both wild-caught fish and aquaculture, mariculture, a variety of aspects around that. For the topic this week, we'll be talking about food production, looking at agricultural techniques, the evolution of agriculture, the different kinds of food crops that are used, and particular environmental problems associated with that. So I wanted to, before we get started with that, I'd like to remind everybody that the Milestone 3 submission is due tonight at midnight. And so I'll try to get through the lecture today and leave enough time so that you can go into your breakout groups and have a work session of at least 15 or 20 minutes to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what needs to be handed in. Any questions about that before we get started?
I have a question, Dr. McDonald.
Yeah, go ahead, Darren.
It says that we can go to that calendar in Canvas and make a date for the meetings.
Yeah.
And I don't see where you do that in my calendar.
Carrie, are you online?
Yeah, I'll send the link in the chat again.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right, yeah, please do go ahead and make that. Okay, and so here's just a reminder of what's due on the rough draft. Teams must submit rough draft copies of their written report and their PowerPoint presentations. Now, this is a rough draft, so I'm not expecting this to be a polished product, but I do want to see that you have the structure, that you've thought through the structure of your project, that you're putting the materials together, and that you have a plan, both in terms of how the final project is going to go together, and then also in terms of how the different members of the team, what they'll be contributing, what different sections or components of the project that each person will be contributing. This is a big thing. You have to have a written report. I'm expecting a fairly lengthy written report, you know, in excess of 10 or 15 pages. And then the PowerPoint presentation also has to be comprehensive. You're going to have a roughly 20-minute period to fill. And so we want to make sure that that material is in place. And then Carrie and I will be meeting with you. That's the purpose of this these sessions that we're scheduling through the calendar. Carrie and I will be meeting with you to go over this rough draft and talk about finalizing it and bringing it so that you're able to focus in the final product in getting both the report and the presentation to the state that they need to be in. Okay, any other questions? So then this will be reevaluated using this rubric. And so as you're familiar with, these are the things that you need to look at when you're thinking about how this submission should go. All right, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'll bring up the screen for the lecture today. Let's see if I can find that. Here we go. Okay, great. So the topic today is food production. This is drawn from chapter 18 in Hossensaal, although in my lecture on Thursday, I'll spend a lot more time talking about fisheries and aquatic food production, both from the ocean and from aquaculture. I'll spend a lot more time on that than Hossensaal does, and I'll also be looking at some different aspects of the material that's in chapter 18. But you have a reading quiz, and you've read through the material and you have a basic idea. So we want to talk about today about human evolution and the food supply. how does the present human being, the human species, depend on agriculture? Because there are very, very few remaining societies where agriculture is not a critical component. Perhaps there are tribes living in the Kalahari Desert or in the deepest Amazon that don't depend on agriculture, but just about every other human being has become a agriculturally dependent species. So how did we get to that place? What is the evolution of agriculture, selecting crop types, the technology that's been used. We'll be talking a little bit about Michael Pollan's presentation of a plant's eye view of the world, the Green Revolution, and then some environmental issues or societal issues to do with agriculture and food supply. Well, human evolution. As I alluded to, there are human beings and human societies that remain, very, very few, who lived as we did in the Paleolithic period. Paleolithic and Neolithic, these are descriptions of human society that depend on the kinds of tools that people used. And so this paleo is old and neo is new, and lithic stands for stone, lithos. And so the tools that people used were made of stone principally. And so we can see a clear distinction between the tools that people used before they invented agriculture and the tools that they used afterwards. Now, the Paleolithic culture, these are human beings that lived and primarily evolved during the last glacial period. So when large portions of the earth were covered with ice sheets, human beings evolved to be hunters, gatherers, foragers, and there was no agriculture to speak of. And the tools that they used were to do with killing, processing animal parts, making simple clothing out of hides and so forth. And so a collection of Paleolithic tools would be focused on that. Well, when the ice retreated, there were vast areas of the landscape that were opened up, and also human beings had begun to evolve intellectual capabilities that allowed them to expand into agriculture. So the tools kit and the archaeological evidence that comes down to us indicates a fairly rapid development of agriculture and spreading across the world. And so we can see this example here is a stone sickle. And so there's a piece of wood, and set into that wood is a sharp piece of flint with one edge has been carefully sharpened. And so this is a very different sort of tool. It's not meant for killing animals or cutting them apart. It's meant for cutting down grain products, probably wheat or something similar. And likewise, there was a domestication of animals. So animals began to actually be used to do work for people. And this work included tilling and plowing soil. So new toolkits. And this was the development of human society after the last glacial period. Well, what kind of products did they use? What kind of plant products did they use, and how are these related to human society? So the conventional thinking about how agriculture developed among human beings was that originally people were migratory. They moved from campsite to campsite according to annual cycles of what sort of local crops would be available, what the movement of prey items, herds of animals and so forth might be at a particular time, availability of water, etc. So the hunter-gatherer societies were sort of migratory, and they followed a pattern of encampments at different sites, and over time they would repeat those encampments. So at a particular season, they would return to a site where they'd been before. And the presence of people at a particular site would disturb the soils. They would trample down the plants that were growing there, uproot them, use them for their own purposes, and disturb the soils. Well, from our previous lecture on disturbance of soils, we know when there's been a removal of the climax type plant community, new plants come in, and these are typically pioneer species that do well under disturbed, when the soil is disturbed and there's an opening for K strategy reproduction. Well, so the idea then is that these seed products, which people would have eaten casually, would be planted at first without, not deliberately, but just as a result of of seeds making their way through human waste into the soil and then growing up, and then people began to discover that they could utilize these seeds as a regular form of food supply. Well, the critical thing so the people are developing a dependence, people are evolving a dependence on certain types of food product, grains in particular. And these grains are also responding to the fact that people are depending on them. So there's this coevolution that takes place. And a critical step in the coevolution is not just that people begin to learn how to till the soil, disturb the soil, and actually deliberately plant seeds, but the seeds themselves, the plants themselves, as they're domesticated or as they're being selected for properties and traits that make them good food products, the plants themselves change and are selected for different things. And the principal change is that the seeds, now in a plant that's not a agricultural crop, seeds fall off of the stem whenever they're ripe. And so all the seeds don't necessarily ripen at the same time, and so they'll fall off at different periods. The key feature of a crop which has been domesticated, a grain crop which has been domesticated, is that all the seeds ripen roughly at the same time, and they cling to the stem even after they're ripe. If you think about this for a minute, you can see why this would be a critical component or a key feature for a domesticated crop to have. So if you're going to harvest, if you're depending on being able to collect these seeds to eat, having them all stay on the plant for as long as possible or until you're ready to harvest them would be a key feature. So these grasses develop and adapt to human cultivation by, first of all, forming larger and more numerous seeds, and then by the seeds clinging to the plant for much longer than they would do in an undomesticated variety. And so we can see this, this change, this development in seeds that have been preserved in archaeological settings. And this is a way that archaeologists and anthropologists can determine that, oh yeah, this is when agriculture became more widespread, when seeds of this variety begin showing up permanently, both in the preserved soils and then also in the pollen that settles as a result of large scale or larger scale agricultural use. Well, that's a process that's taking thousands of years to develop, but over time, agricultural grains are and different crops, grains, legumes, roots, and tubers make up the majority of agricultural crops. So grains are things like wheat, oat, maize, what we call corn, and rice. These are the principal grain types. Although there are other, certainly are other grains that have been used. And we can follow. Yes?
So it was just about the multiple species of humans that you had on that other slide. I just was wondering, we're all considered one species now, right?
Yes, we are.
So there was actually like several different types of humans at the time, because they were like in the process of developing or something.
Yeah, well, that's correct. I mean, I was being a little bit fanciful in terms of the human species because we're genetically similar to Cro-Magnon type humans that lived, during the in the Paleolithic period. But there were other genetically distinct, what we would call separate species that did occur. The most probably widely known as the Neanderthal. So these were a subgroup of, or a not a subspecies, but a distinct species from Homo sapiens. And they lived alongside human beings. There was also a Deniscian variety, and then you probably may have read about the so-called hobbit species. This was a very diminutive species of humans that has been recently discovered in islands of in the Indonesian region. So these were all distinct species of human beings in the sense of different types of birds or different types of species. But what we have but all of the other species of human beings, which may have existed, up until a few tens of thousands of years ago, all of those other species eventually were outcompeted and became extinct. Although some of their genetic traits are maintained in our present species. Is that clear?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that makes more sense. I think I was thinking a little different. Okay.
Yeah, I was being a little bit symbolic in the sense of that we are a species now which depends totally on agriculture. I mean, we could not revert, to hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And there have been changes, sort of fundamental changes in the way that we digest food and the kinds of enzymes that we produce to be able to deal with, the material that's in agricultural products. These are enzymes that Paleolithic people probably didn't have in the same abundance. So there have been some, identifiable changes in the human genome that adapt us to being able to be agricultural species. Okay, so these are the plants. These are the groups of plants: grains, legumes, lentils, broad beans, and roots and tubers. These are turnips, potatoes. You're probably familiar with turnips and potatoes. Cassava is a tuber-like product, and it is a major source of food in among African societies, and also in the Caribbean. Cassava turns up fairly often. So these are the different types of species, and you can see this evolution here, just sort of recapitulated for the evolution of maize, where it starts out as a wild ancestor and then is gradually hybridized and domesticated, first in Mexico, and then it's adapted in Europe, and then to our present day. So you can see that there have been radical changes in what we still call maize, which has got, shares genetic traits with the wild ancestor. Okay, I don't have time. There's a TED Talk, and I'll put the link to the TED Talk to a thinker named Michael Pollan. I don't know if anybody's heard of Michael Pollan. He's an author, writes a lot about food production and agriculture. His most recent book is called How to Change Your Mind, which is about the use of psychedelics. And so he's a really interesting character. He's given a TED Talk called The Plant's Eye View of the World, which unfortunately we don't have time to go through today. But Pollan makes the point, and I'll put the link in here. It's definitely worth it's a 15-minute video, and it's really kind of an eye-opener. But he makes the point that, which I kind of alluded to earlier, that it's not just human beings that are becoming dependent on food, but plants that become dependent on human beings. And he pushes this argument so far as to say that if we think about it, if we sort of flip it around from, assuming that human beings are in charge of everything, to saying, well, maybe plants have got some skin in this game as well, that, from the point of view of corn, for example, we have become the vehicle which produces huge amounts of corn. So if you're a corn DNA and your principle is to get as much of your DNA into future generations as possible, well, human beings are an excellent vehicle for that process. And human beings, this kind of manipulation of animals by plants is by no means limited, or certainly didn't even begin with human dependence on agricultural products, because the development of flowering plants depends on pollinators, and so pollinators and plants evolve together. And one of the treats that plants can make that drive this sort of dependence is the production of sugar. And so here you see so sugar and sugars are something that just about all animals like. And so by producing sugar, the plants are able to manipulate behavior in a variety of different kinds of animals. We think of bees and insects as being principal pollinators, but there are many other animals that pollinate, and including here bats, which come down and lick the nectar. In the process, they get covered with pollen. They then move to another plant and share that pollen. And so by adapting animals to do their pollination for them, plants are able to have a much broader and much more stable genetic basis. So a plant's eye view of the world suggests that plants are in some ways manipulating the behavior of their animal hosts, or their animal cooperators. So that's a way of thinking about this that changes that around. Well, what are some key notions for agriculture? One thing is that different from wild plant communities, what the agriculture of the farmer tries to have is a monoculture, a single plant species, so that all of the effort that you go into cultivating a crop is focused on the actual crop, so that you get the maximum yield for your effort from that. And so we create monoculture areas where the natural system would have a community of different plants. And the other thing that's unique to agriculture is tillage and plowing. And this is the disturbance of the soil, which I referred to as happening accidentally in Neolithic migratory communities, but deliberately when people figured out that, oh, the plants will grow better, the grain will grow better if we disturb the soil, if we dig it up, if we aerate it a little bit. And so plowing doesn't really have a parallel in nature. It's just something that human beings do. So we have to control weeds. There has to be a hydrocycle. The soil itself has to be maintained in terms of its nutrient content. The water has to be brought. And so people have developed a variety of methods, and some of them are quite impressive, for maintaining soils and providing agriculture. And so here's an example of a terraced, probably rice paddies. And you can see just how elaborate this construction is. And so this is something that we find archaeological evidence of this going way back before there were mechanized methods for producing this sort of terracing. But it's a deliberate means for distributing a water supply across an area on a steeper slope. And the other key notion for agriculture is the idea of the nutrient cycle. Plants do not grow unless they have principal nutrients. And for plants, it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and these are the products that plants need, sulfur. And so the different applications for this. Manuring was the way of getting particularly nitrogen back into the soil. Also the practice of leaving fields to go fallow, so producing a crop for several years and then leaving it alone to allow natural bacterial process to recharge the soils with essential nutrients. Most recently, we've become totally dependent on artificial fertilizers, and especially for the nitrogen cycle. Now, I've already showed this picture at an earlier lecture. This is one of my ancestral homes near Leipzig in Germany. When we talked about it before, we talked about what the people were doing here and what they were doing. This is a photograph taken in the springtime, and they're using horse-drawn carriages to take manure out to the fields. And so this was an essential component for keeping agricultural fields productive, was returning some of the nitrogen that was lost in crops back into the soil by taking the waste products of animals. And so this barn here would have been for dairy cattle or other horses and other agricultural livestock, and their manure would have been carefully collected and allowed to process further. And then in the spring of the year, that manure would be taken back out and spread on the fields. And so this process of natural fertilization through manure, was the way in which agriculture really developed all the way through the beginning of the 20th century. So this picture was taken in about 1912. And at that point, there was no means for any other way of completing the nitrogen cycle to the soil other than manuring. However, there is a limit to how much agricultural production you can get through this process. And Europe had, by the middle of the 19th century, sort of by 1850 on, they had really begun to push against the limits of how much food could be produced per acre using animal fertilization. And so as a consequence, particularly with a growing human population, there were distinct shortfalls in the production of food for human societies, such that famine was a component and was always an ever-present concern for human populations. Well, this started changing in the late 1920s with the development of the so-called Haber-Bosch process. And so Haber was a chemist, and he looked at means for creating ammonia. Of course, ammonia is NH4. Its principal component is nitrogen. Nitrogen is about 79% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, so it's an abundant element in, it's actually an abundant molecule in the Earth's system. However, N2, which is atmospheric nitrogen, has two molecular bonds, and these are very difficult to break, this double bond. And so there's a limit to how much nitrogen can be fixed and made available for agriculture. Well, Haber-Bosch figured out or developed a means for introducing methane and water into a system and pulling in air, and then developing through a series of chemical steps and high temperature catalyzation. This process goes through water, H2O and CO2 are rejected, and there are a whole series of processes that eventually produce fluid ammonia. And this is an industrial process. It requires a large scale plant. It's not something that can be done as a sort of a cottage industry or an artisanal product. You need to have an industrial base to produce ammonia in this fashion. And you also need to have abundant fuel sources, because all of these processes in the Haber-Bosch require high amounts of energy and heating. And so, this was developed, and so Haber came up with the initial system, and then Bosch, found ways of implementing it, of operationalizing it for industrial purposes. Now, and so starting in the 1920s, and this was primarily led by Germany, but soon the system leaked out, and other people began following suit. But Germany started out with a strong capability for producing artificially fixed nitrogen in the form of ammonia. Well, nitrates are also a component of explosives. And so the production of ammonia, nitrogen-based fertilizer, was one component driving the spread of nitrogen fixation, but also the impetus for producing large amounts of nitrogen products for production of gunpowder and other types of explosives was another component to this. And so Germany really ramped up its production of nitrogen in the lead up into World War II, and it was followed by other societies, because they felt they needed to produce large amounts of explosives. And so there's an interesting parallel between the spread of artificial fertilizer and the production of explosives. And in fact, after World War II, when World War II was completed, there was sort of excess capability for ammonia and nitrogen fixation industrially. And a lot of that sort of shifted in the post-World War II into agriculture. So there's a sort of a steady increase in the application of artificial fertilizer all the way through, starting in about the 1920s with the invention of the Haber-Bosch system, and then following through into the post-war period. So let's go. So there's one development is the availability and the ability to produce large amounts of nitrogen and other artificial fertilizers. But that was only part of the problem, and of the food supply. And in 1968, it was clear that there were famines that still occurred in the developing world. And a guy named Paul Ehrlich, and then his wife eventually joined him in producing similar books. But his book, The Population Bomb, predicted that agriculture, that the human population would rapidly outstrip the ability of agriculture to produce enough food. And almost like Malthus, Ehrlich predicted wide-scale starvation and social disruption as a result of running out of food. And so the population bomb, which referred to here, you might have heard this term, that was originally thought this was going to explode, sometime in the 1970s or 1980s as a result of burgeoning population, because we know that the population of the planet was growing. Well, why didn't the population bomb explode? Well, I'll go back and tell the story a little bit now, but the important point is that it didn't explode because we changed the way that we produce food agriculturally. And there was a whole series of not just the availability of artificial fertilizer, although this was a critical part of this, but also the use of industrial processes, mechanized agriculture, electrification, etc., the development of chemical pest control. These were all developments in agriculture that in particular prevented the enabled human beings to produce a great deal more food than they had done previously, and prevented this population bomb from exploding, in the sense that it was feared in that period it might happen. Potentially, we have a different sort of population bomb now in terms of climate change and other issues that are and land use issues that are exacerbated by growing human population. But that's a different category of problem from what was predicted back in the late 1960s. Another component of this is something called the Green Revolution. And this character here, Norman Borlaug, an American agriculturalist, he got a PhD in horticulture and took a job working for the Ford Foundation, not the Ford Motor Company, but the Ford Foundation. And he was working in Mexico to try to increase food supply. And what he observed in Mexico was that the indigenous farmers were using seed crops that that didn't produce as much yield per acre as was possible through hybrid crops. And so hybrid crops are sort of very deliberately continuing this process that I referred to of taking the plants and developing, selecting for certain traits that increase their yield. And so this is referred to as hybrid food production. And so Borlaug figured out that they could, introduce seed varieties obtained by this hybridization process, and also introduce ideas such as double cropping. That means planting 2 crops per year, using agricultural irrigation and fertilizers, fossil fuel, etc. So all this together began what became known as the Green Revolution. So starting in the 1970s, there was widespread application of these types of hybrid seeds, hybrid grain varieties, and these, in order to raise these types of grains, there had to be a greater dependence on fossil fuel, fertilizer, and pesticides. And so this whole movement called the Green Revolution really vastly increased the yield. And so you can see that this curve here on the lower right shows, in particular Mexico, which is where Borlaug really got his start, just how much of an impact his practices had. So you can see a steady increase in wheat yields, and similar processes are found in India, Pakistan, and elsewhere. And so the result of the Green Revolution was at least temporary avoidance of this population bomb concept. Where does that leave us? That leaves us in sort of present day agricultural practices, and this is looking at a field of corn, probably from Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest, and this is what you see if you go anywhere at the right time of year, assuming that there's not a drought or something on, and this is the population. So something like 30,000 individual plants per acre. Each one of those plants is going to be producing up to a dozen ears of corn, and then the corn ears themselves are extra large, produce large kernels. And a lot of this corn product is not for having corn on the cob, but for industrial uses. And if you look on any soft drink, one of the principal ingredients in soft drinks is something called high fructose corn syrup. Fructose is a sugar, fruit sugar, and corn produces this in abundance. And so if you look on anything, we are using high fructose corn syrup in a vast variety of foods that we consume on an everyday basis. Ethanol produced from that sugar is also a component in the gasoline that we burn. So up to 10% of the gasoline that we use had its includes alcohol or ethanol, and that ethanol is derived from corn products. And so, we have, our society in particular has become dependent on massive production of corn, not as a food product, but as an as a component in industrialized food and a processed food, and then also even automotive fuel. However, this comes at a cost, and the cost is that as you start increasing the population, the number of plants per acre, initially you can see that there's a productive capability starts falling off, and the agronomic maximum yield level begins to drop when the plant populations become more dense. And so as we increase, there's sort of an upper limit to how much plants, the density of plants per acre, just in terms of the production. And the limits include, not just what the plants are physiologically capable of doing, but also the side effects that come with that. So that let's see if we look here at, what it takes to produce, to bring those 30,000 plants per acre to harvest. It's up to 100 to 200 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per acre. And so this is the sort of the guideline, and this is yield in pounds per acre. So you can see that the curve increases, and then it starts flattening out when you start getting toward 200 pounds per acre. So somewhere in this range is where most of the crops are. So we, like my family in Germany in 1912, we're sort of approaching the limits for what can be done with nitrogen fertilizer, given what plants are capable of. And so that's one issue. Why does that happen? Well, that happens because you just simply can't maintain enough of the fertilizer in the soil for the plants to make use of it. That's one issue in all this. And so agricultural drainage, the way in which agricultural land is, water is managed in agricultural lands, is a critical component in modern agriculture. And so it's not just a matter of finding a piece of productive soil and plowing it and then planting, but it has to be engineered according to a variety of processes. And one of the things that they do is they have subsurface drainage. So they there are pipes and a series of products that allow drainage off the agricultural field into local stream system. And so, this is a sort of a diagram of what that would look like. So rather than having a high water table, this lowers the water table. But allowing water to pass through like this means that only a fraction of the fertilizer that's applied can actually be utilized by the plants. And so there's a trade-off that's happening that makes this possible. And so the loss per acre, so this is the loss, continuous corn, so this is kilograms of hectare per kilograms of nitrogen loss per hectare. Continuous corn, so continuous production of corn means that you're losing about 55 kilograms per hectare per year. If you do a rotation of corn and soybean, there's less of a loss. Alfalfa and perennial grasses and produce even less. And so there's about 50 pounds per acre running off from corn and soybeans, about a third of the 150 pounds per acre applied. So we're losing up to a third of the artificial fertilizer that's applied, and that's kind of built in. We can't do any better, given the sort of way that we're doing agriculture. Well, this loss of process there. So here's just a little diagram of the nitrogen cycle. So the Haber-Bosch system is producing nitrogen fixation and organic nitrogen fixation, sort of augmenting this. So that's we've essentially doubled the nitrogen cycle through our use of artificial fertilizer. Okay, well, so there's some benefits and there's also some limits. There are also some downstream impacts to this massive use of artificial nitrogen and the loss of so much of that into the water system. And so, you know, all those canals and streams that were draining the nitrogen fertilizer off of agricultural land, well, those waters empty into larger streams and rivers, and that eventually ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. So essentially, we're taking, you know, up to a third of the artificial nitrogen fertilizer that we've applied to agricultural fields, putting it in the water, and then a great deal of that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, there are plants living in the Gulf of Mexico as well. They're single-celled algal plants, but they respond like any plants to an increased supply of their essential nutrients. And so there's this cascade effect where you increase by creating a river nitrogen rich and also phosphate and silicon rich runoff. And so that increases algal production in the surface waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Well, those increased algal cells eventually die, and the dead algal cells sink to the bottom and of the ocean. Well, in the bottom, they, you know, when they get to the bottom, they, in order to metabolize those dead, to break them down, requires oxygen. Well, the other thing that happens is that the Gulf of Mexico and waters around the world, coastal waters, during summer months, they tend to get stratified. So there's a picnic line, a density stratification by temperature. And if there are long periods of low wind that don't mix the water column up, the biological oxygen demand for breaking down those excess algal cells that were produced by fertilizing the surface waters, that oxygen is stripped out. And so you can end up with hypoxic or anoxic, well, typically hypoxic layers of water on the bottom of coastal ecosystems. And when the oxygen levels drop below a certain level, it's about 2 milliliters per meter of 2 milliliters per liter of oxygen is sort of the threshold for hypoxia. Below that 2 milliliters per liter level, there's not enough oxygen to support animals, and that so fish will swim away, but animals that are stuck on the bottom, crabs, other kinds of mobile animals, they typically die. And the result of this is something called the dead zone. And Nancy Rabelais here was a professor at Louisiana State University, and she's somebody who's really worked very extensively in understanding and mapping this. And so this is the hypoxia level in 2019, was a particularly big year. And this is sort of showing the, what's being depicted here is the bottom oxygen concentration expressed here as milligrams per liter, milliliters per liter of seawater. And so below, in the below 2 to 3 in the 1 to 2% range, this is where you're getting this acute hypoxia. This produces fish kills and is also harmful for a variety of crustaceans and animals in particular that are stuck on the bottom and can't escape these hypoxic levels. And so this is just sort of showing the change in nitrogen flux by means of the Mississippi Atchafalaya River Basin flux estimate. So this is the range going through. And so there have been some very high years and some very low years. And the higher years definitely correspond to more extensive areas of hypoxia. So there is an example of a sort of a negative cascade or negative feedback loop whereby the amount of production needed for nitrogen fertilization, excess nitrogen fertilization, produces an environmental impact far away from its current area. So that's an example of some of the problems with heavy dependence on artificial nitrogen fertilizers. But there are other issues that also sort of limit the amount of food that can be produced per acre. So, here are some ideas about the you can sort of see the change in here in terms of the historic yields, and we're beginning to fall off of that in terms of the amount of corn and so forth that we're yielding. So we as a society are bumping up against that limit, and part of that has to do with the availability of the sustainability of how soils are managed, because a lot of the heavy industrial use of soils essentially really reduces its vitality as a natural ecosystem, soils, and it becomes much more of a sort of industrialized sort of massive vermiculate across fields. Okay, so nitrogen fertilization is one of the limits there. The other limit that we have in terms of agricultural production is that when we produce crops, we want to eat them, but so does a lot of other things in the world. And you can build fences to keep out, deer and other woodchucks and other sort of animals that would come and eat your crops, birds. But insects have a way of going through all products. And so the ability, particularly in these very large, very densely cropped agricultural fields, one of the problems is finding ways of killing the insect pests that can come in and really reduce the yield or even completely eat it up. So there are a lot of different aspects to that. One of the issues is that the weed killers that are used are very, very toxic, and these toxic compounds, they may or may not break down. This dicamba in particular was is a herbicide that's used to control not so much insect pests, but weeds that grow up in fields. And this was a story that in 1917 there was a farmer that had dicamba on his field, and there was a windy day, and the field, the weed killer drifted over onto a neighboring farm and caused extensive damage, and this resulted in an actual shootout and murder over this. So this is something that people take very seriously. So use of pesticides and pesticides spreading beyond where they're intended to be deployed is an issue. Another issue in modern agriculture is something called genetically modified organisms. I'm sure you've heard of this topic. A GMO, genetically modified organism, is any organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering techniques. So specifically, if a gene is taken from one species and inserted into the genome of a second species, that second species is referred to as genetically modified. Now, this process is fundamentally different from the selective breeding that farmers and human beings have practiced for millennia. Selective breeding, you're taking one species and you're selecting, particular varieties of that species that have some trait that you want to encourage. Larger seeds, bigger, more sugar, whatever the trait is, more rapid growth in the case of animals. Well, when you talk about genetically modified processes or genetically modified organisms, you're not sticking to a single specific line, but you're taking genes from other organisms and splicing them into the genome of the genetically modified organism. And there are a whole variety of crops in which this is practiced, tomatoes, rice, sweet corn, cotton, and we're much more accepting, we tend to be much more accepting of GMOs in the United States than they are in Europe or abroad. Genetically modified agricultural livestock is also possible, but much less widely spread. So, it's possible to modify existing species of agricultural crops to make them more beneficial or more to introduce capabilities that they wouldn't ever have evolved naturally. And one purpose for doing this is to get a higher yield or have better insect resistance. But something else that's been practiced is the use of genetically modified crops that are immune to certain types of pesticide or certain types of herbicide. And this is the case in Roundup. Probably everybody has heard of Roundup. And Roundup is something produced by Monsanto. And so what Monsanto does is it makes this very effective weed killer, Roundup. And what Roundup does is it interferes with photosynthesis and on a wide scale basis. So you have a small amount of Roundup hitting the plant, goes in and attacks the enzyme systems that make photosynthesis possible, essentially starving the plant very quickly. So Roundup is a great way to kill weeds on your, growing up through the cracks in your sidewalk. You hit them with Roundup and they die. Well, what Monsanto did was to develop different types of crops that were immune to the effects of Roundup. So they specifically engineered, using GMO techniques, they specifically engineered types of corn and wheat and etc. that could be exposed to Roundup, but wouldn't respond to it, wouldn't be killed by it. And so then you have this ideal situation where you plant your field with a Roundup ready crop, and then just at the time when weeds would start growing up and reduce your yield, you spray the whole field with Roundup, and that kills everything except the genetically modified crop, which is that you've used. Well, there's a little asterisk here, and that is that where do you get the seeds for this magical crop? Well, you buy them from Monsanto, and the practice, from time immemorial, is that farmers would hold back a certain number of seeds from their crop to plant in the following year. And of course, since they wanted to get good yields, they would hold back the biggest, nicest seeds and plant them. And so that's the natural process of agricultural selection, selecting for high yield crops. But Monsanto says, okay, you can buy seeds from us and you can plant your field of corn with Roundup ready seeds, but you don't own those seeds. So you can't take the seeds that you harvest, set some of them aside and use them for next year's crops. You have to buy all the seeds from us, from Monsanto. Well, this is a creates an interesting set of problems because, of course, plants are, like to grow everywhere and, are spread everywhere. And so there are actual, Roundup police that drive around and, try to detect, farmers that might have, Roundup ready crops growing on their land that haven't paid for it, that haven't bought them from Monsanto, and they actually prosecute copyright violations against these farmers. Well, that's fine, except that, birds carry seeds around. There are many natural ways in which these kinds of products can spread. And so people have been prosecuted and fined. I don't know that anybody's gone to jail for this, but there have been many prosecutions for violation of the copyright privilege that they have. Okay, so just a few more slides here, and then I'll let you go into your meeting. There are, this is more on the idea of intensive pesticide application. And so we're probably all familiar with the McDonald's French fry. These are these beautiful, crispy, flavorful French fries. They're made from a certain kind of russet potato that has a sort of a long growth form. And this is particularly desirable for McDonald's because they can take that long potato and they can chop it up, and then they can, the individual French fries that come out of this are long, and they can put them into this sort of red box with this sort of like bouquet-like look that they find particularly attractive. Well, these potatoes are grown in Idaho and in the Western United States, Northwestern United States, but they're susceptible to a particular type of beetle. And so in order for to control this beetle, when they plant out a field of these russet potatoes, at the time before they would harvest them, they come back and spray them down with a particularly toxic pesticide called Monitor. And this pesticide is what is needed. If they didn't do this, then the beetles would just explode and eat all the potatoes, and there'd be no, well, they eat the leaves of the potato plants, and there'd be no French fries. So they spray this using crop dusters. They spray this material on the fields. And this is so toxic that the USDA recommends that farmers don't re-enter the fields until 4 days after the pesticide has been sprayed. And 4 days is probably pushing it. And then after they harvest the potatoes, they have to put them in giant sheds the size of football stadiums, and they have to leave them there for several weeks so they can off-gas the leftover Monitor material, components, and be safe for human consumption. So when you eat a French fry, you're first of all eating a starch food product that's produced by this very industrialized process. And then, of course, there are also a bunch of other things in the French fry. Potatoes, canola oil. So potatoes are the #1 thing. But then all these different oils, natural flavor. And then you just sort of read down the list, and it gets harder and harder to pronounce and scarier and scarier to think about. But all that goes into what makes a French fry. So that when we think about something as simple as eating potatoes, in the industrialized approach, it actually becomes something far more complex. A little bit more, since we're talking about McDonald's, no relation to me, by the way. McDonald's, of course, depends on beef. And it's kind of interesting to note that Burger King has come out, and a number of other the fast food hamburger joints have come out, or hamburger companies have come out with what is it, the Impossible Burger, which I've had. They're actually pretty good, from Burger King. Well, McDonald's has no plans to introduce a meat-free hamburger because they are the #1 distributor of beef and meat products in the world. And their beef comes from, not from cows roaming around in a field and then being, or, being, free range cattle that are collected at the end of the season and driven, by cowboys into up the Chisholm Trail to Abilene for production. No, they're raised in what are called feedlots, and these are basically large areas with no plants or anything growing, fenced off, and then the cattle are put here as when they're reared and brought in as sort of yearling cattle, and then they're fattened up in these feedlots, fattened up with by principally eating corn and other silage products, and so they're artificially fattened up with corn. Well, cows are not adapted to eating corn. Cows are adapted to eating grass. And so when you feed them corn, it introduces all these problems. And so there's a whole series of things that have to be done to the cattle in order to make them, allow them to survive and thrive in these feedlot operations. One of the things that has to happen is that they have to control bacterial infections in the guts of the cattle that result from this overrich supply of nutrients from the corn. And so they end up feeding these cows huge amounts of antibiotics, as a means of controlling that. So we get a lot of problems associated with these feedlots. The other thing that happens is that when I talked about the connection between manuring and sort of the return of the nitrogen cycle, the nutrient cycle, where a typical agricultural had both livestock and farm fields. Well, you have sort of fields of corn in Iowa and feedlots in Texas and Wyoming, and there's a huge separation. So all the manure that's produced in these cattle lots doesn't end up going back to fertilize farm fields. It's just basically a waste product that is not really disposed of in any kind of sustainable way. So feedlot operations, most feedlots have over 1,000 head of cattle, and they're concentrated in these areas. They're fed corn, and nothing is really done with the fertilizer. 5% of the feedlots have more than 5% have more than 1,000 head, and they account for 85% of the cattle sent to market. Feedlots with 32,000 head account for 40% of the cattle sent to market, and 100% of the cattle sent to McDonald's. So when you eat a McDonald's hamburger, you're eating something that was produced by this process. And so okay, I see in the chat that McDonald's is planning to introduce a plant product. Well, good for them, finally. Okay, so that's an issue in terms of food production. And it's not just beef cattle that are produced through feedlot operations. Chickens, pigs are now predominantly raised in these different kinds of feedlot operations. So there are sheds for chicken and pigs, small fenced lots for cattle, and there are many, many health and ethics issues around these practices. There's a sort of a fundamental concept that we're mistreating these animals by crowding them into these impossibly tight circumstances where they basically don't have time even to turn around. What's depicted here, these chickens are being raised probably for meat chickens. Meat chickens are, reach maturity in about 12 weeks. and they have to be harvested after 12 weeks because they get too big. They can't stand up or walk. So these chickens here in this picture are crowded into this immense system. It does seem cruel somehow, and not to put too fine a point of it on it. So there's a concern about mistreatment of animals in these types of products. There's also concern for pollution from the waste and runoff, and as I alluded to in the whole issue of feedlots. And there's an extensive use of antibiotics. So the antibiotics are needed to prevent infection. They're also needed to promote more rapid growth. If you think about a livestock product animal which is growing and you're feeding it, if it's got bacteria in its gut that are also eating some of that food, that decreases the productivity that you get for the amount of feed that you're giving. So by killing the bacteria in the guts of chickens and pigs and cattle, you can increase the amount of food that turns into meat, which is eventually harvested. So there are a lot of issues with that. And I think some of the teams are actually looking at some of these things. So perhaps we'll get some more presentations of these down the road. These are just some hot, feeder to finish. So we're just looking at the most of these. So feeder to finish means that they're brought in as young and then they're fattened up in these facilities. Whereas farrow to finish means that the young hogs are raised from birth. So that's declining as a practice. So this kind of production is of concern. And likewise, you can make a similar argument about chickens. So these are meat chickens. Well, I'll close, talk about some pig farms and waterborne diseases. Actually, maybe I better just stop right here. And I've got a couple more slides about manure lagoons and how these kind of problems associated with these lagoons. And, as we get these chickens and pig operations, particularly in the Carolinas and in Georgia, they produce. They have to do something with the manure, and the something that they do is to put it into these large lakes or lagoons. And eventually it can be treated. Some of it breaks down naturally, but if you get flooding, well, all of that material enters into the watershed with deleterious effects. Okay, now there is something called sustainable agriculture, and Michael Pollan talks about that a lot. And sustainable practices try to use the cascade principles of natural ecosystems so that different components of your agricultural system are reinforcing each other. And so, for example, it's sustainable, cattle rearing or sustainable chicken rearing. The cows come in and they eat the first bite from grassy plants. So they come into a field, the grass hasn't yet been harvested, and the cows come in and eat the first bite, and then they're rotated to a new plot. And the grass, if it's not cropped down to the roots, it regrows much more quickly than it would. The flies lay eggs on the cow patties, and after several days, the eggs hatch as maggots, and then they bring in mobile chicken coops that are moved onto the fields, and the chicken eat the maggots in the cow patties, and they scrape it down. They spread the manure around. So by this practice, you can increase the amount of production and not end up with problems of manure accumulation, and not break this a natural cycle between agricultural livestock and cropping. Okay, well, let me stop there. Now I have gone too long. I will stop there and answer any questions. Any questions? No questions?
Professor, I had a question on
Yes.
like GMO and like aquaculture.
Yeah.
Can you say that species that who are farmed from, aquaculture are genetically modified in a sense? Because like I know genetic variation like changes within aquaculture, like within all the species that are farmed because they control like breeding. But like, can you say those are GMOs or is that like
No,
a
a,
different
a
concept?
GMO has to have a foreign gene inserted into its genome.
Okay.
So, and I think there are genetically modified salmon that are out there that have been, I'm not
Mhm.
sure what the modification, but you also have many varieties of, that are, selectively bred to produce, salmon that do better in fish pens and so forth. So that's, but to be a GMO, there has to be that genetically inserted gene from a different organism, typically bacteria.
So,
Um,
so like releasing like chemicals, let's say to like kill a disease. Let's say you had a farm and you like, a disease spread within like the salmon, let's say, and you release like chemicals to kill those like, EDCs, and that would cause like genetic change in their offspring. Would that still not be categorized as a GMO?
No, not
Because,
strictly speaking. No, that's a
okay.
selective pressure, even though it's
Mm,
pretty, special sort of selective pressure. But you're starting with the genome, and whatever
mm-hmm.
changes happen to the genome as a result of selection, you're still operating from that basic collection of genes. It's not until you insert the new gene that you get a genetically modified or organism.
Okay. Thank you.
But there are problems, in aquaculture, for example, the fish species salmo is the Atlantic salmon. And, that's the one that's been most extensively utilized. Well, they take the salmo and they take it to the Pacific coast where there are other species of salmon that are, native to that area. Well, the Atlantic salmon escape from
Mm-hmm.
from their enclosures and become, essentially invasive species in this new aquatic environment. So, um,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know there's like genetic consequences with aquaculture, but I just wondered if it was like considered under the GMO umbrella. But I guess it's actual like splicing a foreign gene.
actual
Gotcha.
splicing of a foreign gene. That's an important point because, we need to be precise about how we think about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And also because, a lot of crops in the United States are not allowed to be sold in Europe. And specifically because there are European restrictions and regulations against the use of GMOs. And so, in that case, well, what are you restricting? Well, it has to meet this definition of, of this genetic, splicing of the new genetic material into the genetically modified organism. Okay, well, and I guess I'll leave the thing open if you all want to. What's the feeling? Would you like to get together? I guess I went a little bit longer than I'd planned to on the material here. We had some questions. Is everybody? Are there any teams that are really up against it, not being able to get done? Are there any issues that we can bring up and settle?
So is there like a minimum number of slides to the PowerPoint, or as long as it takes 20 minutes to give a presentation, it's fine?
Yeah, well, the rule of thumb is 1 minute per slide, no more than, to allow at least 1 minute per slide. And so, and as you can see, well, I started out this lecture with 30 slides, more or less. I've easily talked through, better than an hour. So, if you're putting together your presentation, you want to limit yourself to, about 20 slides. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Other questions about the milestone?
Wait, was there a minimum of pages you wanted for the paper?
No, I'm not looking for a minimum. I think there's a requirement for how long the paper needs to be. You know, you do need to have the, you know, the number of citations. You need to develop all the ideas that you're talking about. But you know, I'm looking for, you know, I'm not looking for the finished paper, but I'm looking to make sure that you've got the structure there and that I can see where everything is going.
Okay, thank you.
So I think practically speaking, you know, you're probably going to need to have about 10 pages anyway. But you know, clearly if it's too short, I'll let you know.
Professor, when it comes to figures and tables in the rubric, it says it has its own place, like for figures and tables, but are those the PowerPoint presentation, or do you want those added to the paper as well?
Well, a lot of the paper, a lot of the figures that you're going to use in your PowerPoint presentation will also be in the paper.
Okay.
So, you know, it's a little bit up to each team, you know, how much you put in the paper, how much you put in the PowerPoint presentation. I think the PowerPoint presentation is probably going to typically have more slides because you'll have bullets and tables and things like that than you would have in the paper.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions?
If we don't make it to 20 slides for this first rough draft, will we be penalized significantly, or?
No, but I just want to see that you're on track, that you know where you're going, that you know that you've thought this through. I mean, if you have like one slide or 3 slides, that's not going to be enough. You know, how many do you have for your team?
We were going to shoot for around 10 for this first draft, so that we can get some feedback on how long you want them to be, because I know usually when you do a PowerPoint, you don't want heavy information, just bullet graphs are useful.
Yeah.
So I think we can expect 10.
Okay, well, you know, depending on what you choose, so that should be enough. Okay, other questions? Other discussion? Is anybody a vegetarian? Anybody feel inclined to become a vegetarian after the?
Yes.
I thought about it. I was never, I've always eaten meat. No one in my family has ever been vegetarian, but as I have grown to like animals more as I've gotten older, and just being interested in environmental science and stuff, it's kind of like pushing me towards it, just because, like, I don't know, then I think more and more about like killing animals, and I'm like, what is happening to me?
I think that it's not just the fact that you're killing them, right? Because we're not in a hunter-gatherer society anymore. I think it's the practices and the ways that we are doing it that is fundamentally wrong, not just because of the animals, but also because of our health. I was reading an article today that was very interesting, and it talked about how pandemics are way more probable because of our farming techniques that we have right now. And just to think that it kind of put into perspective the pandemics that we've had in the past 20 years or something like that. Or no, it was even more than that. It went far back than that. And most of them originated from an animal passing it into a human, similar to how this coronavirus one was with the bat, right? And the raw bat markets that they have and stuff like that. So it goes farther than environmental impacts. I think it's also affecting our health, and that is something to consider.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of evidence that, you know, in terms of antibiotics, antibiotic resistance, you know, is a real issue in, you know, in medical science. There's so many you know, antibiotics that essentially don't work anymore. because evolution, because bacteria are, responding to the selection pressure that says, okay, if you want to survive, you need to be able to resist penicillin or whatever the antibiotic is. And if this selection process is hugely magnified by agricultural uses, then it really, can produce these antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria that can be a big problem. So there are many issues where food production, impacts our health.
Yes, and as a last thought, something that I put on the chat earlier, and a quote that has really helped me live a healthier lifestyle when it comes to food is, we don't need everybody to be perfectly vegan or vegetarian. You just need more plant-based meals in your diet, and more meals every day that don't necessarily require meat protein, because we're used to meat protein for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and maybe just transitioning to once a day. If we all did it, it would just help immensely. So, we don't need to be perfect vegans, just many people trying to reduce meat consumption will be enough.
Yeah, well, my personal practice is that I very consistent vegetarian, but once a month or so I'll have some meat, maybe less than that. But I don't have a fundamental moral objection to eating pigs and chickens. But I like you say, I think it's if we could cut that back, that's probably, of the personal choices that we can make, that's probably one of the more impactful ones, to try to reduce meat consumption. Now, whether or not Americans in particular, would make that choice, I don't know. But I find that I don't miss meat very much. Every once in a while, I kind of think it would be nice to have a plate of ribs,
Right.
or something like that. But,
Or knowing that you have the freedom to have turkey and things for Thanksgiving, for example.
yeah, well,
You don't
right,
have to
right.
be that restrictive. You
You've
can
all
keep
heard of this.
tradition.
You've all heard of this issue of all the turkeys, that the farmers, that the COVID has really impacted livestock producers. First of all, they were the pigs, and so pig production really, when you eat pork or bacon, the animal that you're eating is usually about 6 months old, 6 to 8 months old, because when pigs get bigger than that, and of course they get much bigger than that, they're too big for the slaughterhouses to handle. And so when the sales of meat really fell off a cliff in April, the pork producers had to kill and dispose of into landfills thousands and thousands of pigs that had grown beyond the size that they were, where they could be produced. And the same thing is presently happening with turkeys, because the Thanksgiving gathering and celebration is going to be scaled way back. The poor turkey producers are stuck with many hundreds of thousands of turkeys that have gotten too big, or they're the big turkeys are not what people want, because they're not having the family meals with 20 people, right, 30 people present.
So our so it's kind of strange. I mean, that you mentioned that, because that means that our methods of making everything easier and on a grander scale so that we can mass produce or whatever food are just because normally if you were just oh, let's go hunt this pig and then cut it up and all that and cook it, it wouldn't matter how big it was. Bigger would probably be better. But
Right.
A system that's just kind of like a car assembly line, now they're now it makes waste because the system is built a certain way.
Right.
It's unsustainable.
Yeah, that's an interesting fact, because it's there's nothing wrong with the pigs. They should be better, but now they don't fit in the system.
Right, that's right. And that's an sort of interesting kind of ironic issue, is it sort of we're not trying to maximize the production of pork, sort of, get as much pork as possible. It has to sort of fit into this, production line flow where, the pigs get to a certain size and then they, load it onto trucks and they have to go, be lifted up onto hoists and things for, being killed and then turned into bacon and sausage and pork chops. So yeah, there's a lot of irony and a lot of sort of counterintuitive things in food production. Dr. Jeff Chanton teaches a course on food issues. I'm not sure if he's offering it. Probably he'll offer it next semester. And that's that he spends a whole course talking about the different issues of food production. So I recommend that.
What did you say the name of the professor was?
Chanton, Dr. Chanton, Chanton. I think he's offering that next semester. Not
I'll
sure.
look into it.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting topic of a side of environmental science that I'm just speaking about myself right now. I personally am very interested in it, so I will definitely look into that.
Yeah, I've noticed that, a lot of students are really very interested in this. First of all, it's a rich topic for, sort of thinking. And it also comes down to this sort of personal choice thing. So you can make a choice about how you eat, in terms of how much processed food you eat and, whether it's you're vegetarian or, flexitarian. Those are all choices that individuals can make. And there are direct sort of repercussions, so that makes it a real sort of intriguing topic for a lot of students.
And it is an action that all of us take every single day, like whether you want it or not. You have to, you can decide not to ride a car and take your bike instead to help with the fossil fuel, and all that stuff. But when it comes to food, we all gotta eat. So finding more sustainable ways to do it is truly important, I believe, for the future generations.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for this class, Professor. I'll see you on Thursday.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll end here for everyone, and we'll talk on Thursday.
Thank you.